The well ran dry in August. That was the first problem. It happened on the morning of the 14th, 1976, when Raymond Castellano pulled the lever on the pump house and heard the motor whine against nothing. No water came up, just air and the smell of hot metal. He shut it off before it burned out. Stood there in the dark of the pump house a while. He was 61 years old. Had farmed the same 90 acres above Davenport, California, since 1948. The ranch sat on a coastal bench north of Santa Cruz. Artichokes, mostly, some Brussels sprouts on the lower ground. The land caught the wind straight off the Pacific, and the fog rolled in most mornings, thick and gray, and burned off by noon. Raymond had farmed in that fog for 28 years and never thought of it as anything but weather. The drought had started 2 winters back. The rains of 1975 came light. The rains of 1976 barely came at all. By that August, the creek that fed his stock pond was a line of dry stones. The water table had dropped below his well casing. The county was calling it the worst dry spell since 1936. 40 years. Raymond drove to the well driller in Santa Cruz that afternoon. A man named Gus Pirelli. Pirelli had drilled half the wells on the north coast. He told Raymond the water table was down everywhere. Said deepening the well meant going another 80 feet, maybe more. Quoted him $4,200 and no guarantee. Said even if they hit water, the way the season was going, it might not hold. Raymond did not have $4,200. The artichoke crop the year before had brought $9,000 gross, and most of that was already spent on the mortgage and the diesel and the boy's truck. His wife Elena kept the books. Had kept them since 1948, every cost and every check in a ledger she ruled by hand. She showed him the page that night at the kitchen table. The balance after the season's bills was $610. A deepened well was $4,200 with no promise of water. The numbers did not meet, and there was no arguing with them. Elena did not tell him what to do. She had grown up on a dry farm in the Salinas Valley and knew that a worried husband needed quiet more than advice. She just turned the ledger so he could see it. Then she went to bed. Raymond sat with the ledger a while. Then he drove home the long way the next afternoon, up the coast road with the window down. The fog was coming in early that evening. It rolled over the cliffs in a wall and beaded on the windshield inside of a mile. By the time he turned up his own drive, the wipers were going. Water ran down the glass in streaks. He sat in the truck a minute before he went in. Looked at the water on the windshield. It was just fog, but it was wet. Raymond didn't sleep much that night. He kept thinking about the windshield, about how the truck had been dry on the coast road and wet by his gate, and nothing had fallen from the sky. The fog had laid itself onto the glass. He'd watched it do it. The water had to come from somewhere. The next morning, he walked his fence lines in the fog before it burned off. He'd walked them 10,000 times. This time, he looked at them. The wire was wet, beaded all along its length. Where the beads got heavy, they ran together and dripped off the bottom strand into the dirt. A line of damp soil ran the whole length of the fence, directly below the wire. He'd never noticed it. It had been there every foggy morning for 28 years. He held his hat under the wire and watched it collect drops. Took maybe 3 minutes to wet the felt through. The fence was catching water out of the air. He went to the county library in Santa Cruz that week. Asked the woman at the desk for anything on fog. She found him a thin folder. Most of it was Weather Service bulletins, but there was one article, photocopied from a science magazine, about researchers in Chile. In the Atacama Desert. They had strung up panels of mesh on the hills above a fishing village. The fog blew through the mesh and condensed on the fibers and ran down into gutters and pipes. A village that got almost no rain was drinking fog. The article said one good panel could yield several gallons a day. Some yielded far more. Raymond read it twice, photocopied it for a dime, drove home. He told his neighbor about it first, a man named Bud Halloran, who farmed the next bench south and had known Raymond since they were both young. Raymond showed him the article at the feed store. Halloran read part of it, handed it back. Said the Chileans could do what they liked in Chile. Said Raymond didn't have a desert. He had a farm, and a farm needed real water, not damp air. Told him the fog wouldn't fill a teaspoon worth bothering with. Raymond folded the article and put it in his shirt pocket. The man behind the counter at the feed store had heard it too. So had 2 other growers buying seed. Word moved up and down the coast the way it always did. By the next week, the talk at the co-op was that Castellano had lost his well and his sense both. That he was going to farm artichokes on fog. One man asked him, not unkindly, whether he'd be milking the clouds next. Raymond agreed it sounded foolish. Said he'd find out one way or the other. He built the first net behind the barn. Used what he had. 2 redwood fence posts, 10 feet apart, sunk 3 feet down and standing 8 feet above the ground. Between them he stretched a panel of plastic shade cloth left over from the seedling beds. The kind with the fine weave, the 70% shade grade. He'd bought a roll of it years back and never used half. The panel measured 8 feet tall and 10 feet wide. 80 square feet of mesh. The first try, he stretched the cloth flat and tight like a bedsheet. The fog beaded on it but ran off the sides as much as the bottom. He restrung it the next day with a slight belly in the middle, so the whole sheet drained to one low corner. That worked better. He stapled the cloth to a furring strip along the bottom edge to give the water a clean lip to run off. Small things. He figured them out one morning at a time. Below the bottom edge he nailed a length of rain gutter salvaged off the chicken coop. Pitched it slightly so it ran downhill to one end. Set a clean 5-gallon bucket under the low end. Cost him nothing but a Saturday and 4 nails. The first fog rolled in the next morning before 6. Raymond stood in the wet gray and watched. The fog blew through the shade cloth. He could see it happen. The mesh went dark with moisture. Beads formed on the fibers, the same as on his fence wire, but 100 times more of them, because there was 100 times more wire. The beads grew and ran together and slid down the cloth into the gutter. The gutter carried them to the low end. The drops came off the lip and into the bucket. One at a time at first. Then, faster. By the time the fog burned off around 11, the bucket held water. Raymond carried it to the barn and measured it in a milk can with gallon marks. 2.5 gallons. From one foggy morning. From 80 square feet of leftover shade cloth. He stood there and did the arithmetic out loud. 2.5 gallons from 80 square feet. That was a little over 0.03 of a gallon per square foot. It didn't sound like much. But Raymond had 1,000 feet of fence on the windward side of the ranch. And the coast fog blew most mornings from May clear through September. 5 months. He started counting in his head and got a number large enough that he stopped and counted again on paper that night. If he could build enough mesh, the fog would water the farm. The trouble was scale. One net gave 2.5 gallons. A mature artichoke field needed thousands of gallons a day in the dry months. He could not close that gap with leftover shade cloth and chicken coop gutter. He needed acres of mesh, and he had a roll and a half. So he started where the water was best. He'd noticed the fog came thickest along the western ridge of the property, where the land rose to meet the wind off the sea. The first row of nets went there. He bought more shade cloth from the nursery supply in Watsonville. the 70% grade, in 12-foot rolls. $38 a roll. Each roll covered about 3 panels. He bought 10 rolls to start. $380. It was nearly all the cash he had left after the season. Bud Halloran watched him hauling posts up the ridge and shook his head from his own fence line. Didn't come over. Didn't offer to help. Raymond set the posts himself. 8-foot redwood, sunk 3 feet, 10 feet on center. He ran a top wire and a bottom wire between them, taut, like a fence, and hung the shade cloth between the wires so it stood up to the wind without tearing. The wind was the enemy. The first panel he hung loose blew out in one night, the cloth flogging itself to rags by morning. He learned to leave a gap at the bottom so the wind spilled through instead of pushing the whole panel like a sail. He learned to double-stitch the edges with baling wire. He learned the spacing, the tension, the pitch of the gutter, all of it by ruining the first few and watching what failed. By the end of September, he had a row of fog nets 200 feet long up the western ridge. 20 panels, 1,600 square feet of mesh. The drought held. The well stayed dry. But every foggy morning, the nets ran. He ran the gutters from all 20 panels into a single 4-inch PVC pipe he buried just under the surface, pitched downhill toward an old concrete cistern his predecessor had built in the 1930s, and capped and forgotten. Raymond uncapped it, cleaned it out. It held 6,000 gallons. He'd never used it because the creek had always run. Now the creek was stones, and the cistern was the only thing he had to hold what the nets caught. The first full week of fog filled it a quarter of the way, about 1,500 gallons in 7 mornings, from 1,600 square feet of mesh that had cost him under $500 and his own labor. Raymond measured it every morning with a sounding stick he marked in inches. Wrote the numbers in a notebook. He had farmed by feel for 28 years. Now he farmed by the stick and the notebook, because the numbers were the only thing that told him whether the foolishness was working. The winter rains of 1977 failed too. 3 dry years running now. The county declared an emergency. Trucks hauled water to the towns. Ranches up and down the coast were selling stock and tearing out orchards they couldn't keep alive. The Hendricks place south of Davenport pulled out 40 acres of apple trees that fall. 40 years in the ground, gone in a week, because there was no water to carry them through summer. Raymond did not pull out anything. He built more nets. By the spring of 1977, he had 3 rows on the ridge, 60 panels, 4,800 square feet of mesh. He'd refined the design. Wider panels now, the full 12 feet on taller posts. He'd switched from the shade cloth to a tighter polypropylene mesh he found through a nursery catalog out of Salinas. It cost more, $61 a roll, but it caught nearly half again as much water. The finer the weave, up to a point, the more droplets it snagged out of the passing fog. He'd also learned to read the fog itself. The thick gray fog that wet everything was the good fog. But there was a thinner high fog, more like low cloud, that didn't yield much. And there was wind. A net needed wind to push the fog through it. On still mornings, the fog just sat, and the nets dripped slow. He oriented every row to face the prevailing afternoon into morning flow off the water, northwest to southeast, so the fog blew straight through the mesh instead of sliding along it. By June of 1977, the cistern wasn't enough. The nets were yielding more than 6,000 gallons could hold across a good foggy stretch. He built a second cistern. This one a lined earthen pond, 40 feet across, dug into a low spot below the ridge so the net water ran into it by gravity. He sealed it with bentonite clay, 40 bags of it, the old cattleman's trick, walked in by his own boots over 3 days. The pond held 50,000 gallons, Now he had storage. And he had a problem he hadn't had before: getting the water from the ridge to the fields. The nets sat high on the windward ridge. The artichokes grew on the benches below. Water runs downhill, and Raymond had set the whole system to use that. Gravity feeding the cistern and the pond from the nets. From the pond, he ran a 2-inch main down to the field edge. But the artichokes needed the water spread, not dumped. Flood irrigation would waste most of it to the dry ground and the sun. So he laid drip line. He'd read about it in the same catalog that sold him the mesh. 1/4-inch tubing, emitters spaced to the plant. It used a fraction of what flooding took. He bought 3,000 feet of it. $210. Laid it by hand down the rows, on his knees, an emitter at every artichoke crown. He plumbed a screen filter at the pond outlet so the tubing wouldn't clog. Set the system to run at night, from 2 in the morning till dawn, when the air was coolest and the least water was lost to the sun. The numbers told him why it mattered. Flood irrigation on that ground took close to an acre-inch of soaking. Most of it sunk past the roots or burned off by the afternoon heat. The drip put the water at the crown, a cup at a time, where the plant could use nearly all of it. A field that drank 20,000 gallons under flood took maybe 6,000 under drip. The fog nets could not have kept up with flooding. They could just keep up with drip. The two halves of the system had to fit, and Raymond had built them to fit without ever drawing it on paper. He built it the way he'd learned everything else. One failed try at a time. The summer of 1977 was the test, the worst of the 3 dry years. By July, the coast was brown from Half Moon Bay to Monterey. Wells were failing all along the bench. The Hendricks place was bare dirt where the apples had been. Bud Halloran's Brussels sprouts came in stunted and bitter that year, half a crop, because he'd had to ration what little well water he had left. Raymond's artichokes stayed green. The fog did the work. Every morning from May to September it rolled in off the Pacific and blew through 4,800 square feet of mesh on the western ridge and gave up its water 1 drop at a time. The pond stayed near full through the worst of July. The drip line carried it to the fields in the cool dark before dawn. Raymond walked the rows at first light, in the fog, and the plants were firm, and the soil was damp, and the heads were filling. There was a stretch in August he watched close. 2 weeks of weak fog, thin and high, when the nets ran slow and the pond dropped lower than he liked. He cut the drip cycle back, watered tighter, walked the field every morning looking for the first sign a plant had given up. He found none. Then the thick fog came back on a Thursday and ran the nets hard, and the pond came back up. The crop held. The artichoke harvest that fall came in at full yield. Better than full. The night watering and the steady moisture had grown bigger, tighter heads than the old flood method ever had. The buyer from the cannery in Castroville, a man named Sal Mendez, weighed Raymond's load and asked how he'd done it in a year that broke half the farms on the coast. Raymond told him about the nets. Mendez drove out to the ridge to see them. Stood in the morning fog and watched the mesh drip into the gutters. Didn't say much, but he asked a lot of questions. Mendez wrote it up, in his way. The cannery put out a grower's newsletter 4 times a year, mostly prices and planting dates. That winter it ran half a page on a Davenport grower, harvesting full artichoke crops on fog-caught water while his neighbors went dry. It did not use Raymond's name. It described the mesh, the posts, the gutters, the gravity ponds, almost exactly as he had built them. Raymond read it at the kitchen table where Elena had shown him the ledger. She asked if he was going to write in and correct the part about the name. He said the newsletter said it for him. Put it in the drawer. Bud Halloran never came to look. not that year. But the spring after, Raymond saw posts going up on Halloran's windward fence line. Shade cloth strung between them. Halloran never mentioned it. Never said Raymond had been right. Just built his own nets and farmed on fog like everyone said couldn't be done. Raymond didn't bring it up either. Didn't need to. The drought finally broke in the winter of 1978. The rains came back heavy that year. The creek ran again. The well, deepened at last with money from 2 good crops, came back up. Most growers on the coast went back to their wells and their flood irrigation and forgot the dry years as fast as they could. Raymond kept the nets. He had learned something in 1976 that he was not going to unlearn just because it rained. The fog came every summer, drought or no drought, free off the Pacific. And now he knew how to catch it. He ran the nets through the dry months every year after, even the wet ones, and let the well rest. By 1981, he had over 200 panels on the western ridge. 16,000 square feet of mesh. On a good foggy morning, they yielded better than 400 gallons before the sun burned the fog away. Across a 5-month fog season, they put tens of thousands of gallons into his ponds without a single dollar of pump diesel or a single foot of dropping water table. Other growers came to look. Once it was clear it worked. Not many, maybe a dozen over the years, some from as far as Mendocino. Raymond showed them the mesh, the posts, the gutters, the gravity lines, the bentonite ponds, the night drip. Told them it wasn't complicated. The fog was already there. It had always been there. A man just had to put something in its way and let it run downhill. He told them about the windshield, sometimes. About the morning the well ran dry, and the fog beaded on his glass on the coast road, and he understood the water had been falling on his farm every morning of his life, and he had been letting all of it blow past. Raymond Castellano farmed the same 90 acres above Davenport until 1991. Retired at 76. Sold the ranch to a young couple from San Jose who had read about the fog nets in a farming journal before they ever saw the land. They kept all of it. The mesh on the ridge, the gravity lines, the bentonite ponds, the drip his predecessor had laid by hand. They found his notebook in the pump house, the one with the sounding stick numbers penciled in, gallon by gallon, fog by fog, going back to August of 1976. They still use it. Raymond drove out to the ridge once in 1996. Early morning. The fog was in off the water, thick and gray, the good fog, and the nets were dark with it and dripping into the gutters, the same as the first morning behind the barn 20 years before. The artichokes below the ridge were green. He didn't stop. Didn't need to. They had said his fog nets were foolish. The fog never said anything at all. It just kept rolling in off the sea. And Raymond had finally learned to catch it.